All right, anti-deg. Now we're in the real stuff. So, disclaimers. All right, so what we've talked about is we had designated uses, which are your management objectives for your waters. We talked about that Monday afternoon. We spent all day yesterday on criteria, which are the levels of the pollutants that you can have and still be protecting your designated uses. And right now, we will talk about anti-degradation policy and implementation methods, which really is about setting up a framework to maintain and protect water quality that has already been achieved. It's really about the maintain portion of the restore and maintain part of the Clean Water Act. So there are two components of the anti-degradation program. There's the anti-degradation policy, which really talks about what the goals are for that framework. Like what are the kinds of protections that you're going to provide? Our regulations say that the states shall develop and adopt statewide anti-degradation policies. The second portion is the implementation method, and we'll talk about both. Is really about how the state, territory, tribe is going to apply or implement the policy. And the way our regulations are written is we require states to develop the methods. They don't have to be adopted. They don't have to be binding. But these methods that are developed do have to be consistent with the state's policy. It has to be consistent with our own regulations. And there has to be an opportunity for the public to provide input, both on any revisions that are being made to the implementation methods, as well as being publicly available. So some of this language is stuff that we added in 2015 because the comments that we had gotten from the public was that there were states who said they had implementation methods, but the only way to get them would be to call up somebody and ask them to pull it out of their desk, which didn't quite work for the whole publicly available thing. So we made that explicit. All right, so we'll talk about the policy first. So as I said, states and authorized tribes have to actually adopt the statewide anti-degradation policy. The policy includes really three levels of protection. There's a protection for existing uses. So that's how it sort of ties into the designated use part of it. So it's sort of your baseline. You got to protect what has already been achieved since November 28th, 1975. There's a process to protect high quality waters, which really are the levels of water quality that go beyond what is necessary to protect the Clean Water Act goals. And there's two components to that, and we'll talk about it, two components of that process. One is, how do you actually identify what is a high quality water? And then there's an analysis of alternatives to decide whether or not there's something else that can be done in terms of authorizing a lowering that wouldn't take up that assimilative capacity as much. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. And then there is a protection for outstanding national resource waters, which are identified by the state or tribe, and then compliance with 316, which is really just thermal discharges. All right, so what are these three tiers of protection? It is important to know this is not three tiers of high quality. It doesn't mean that tier 2 waters are better than tier 1 and tier 3 waters are better than tier 2. It's really about protections. Tier 1 existing uses, this is like your baseline. Okay, you got to at least maintain what you've already protected. Tier 2 for high quality waters, what you're really talking about is a process to decide whether or not you want to use up assimilative capacity. So you'll remember Monday, oops, that was not good. Monday, we talked about climate change and resilience. This is the place, one of the main places where you can decide how to maintain sort of a level of resilience is in the decisions on whether or not to use up some of that assimilative capacity. If you can protect some of that assimilative capacity, then you've got some space, for your water to sort of jiggle around with climate change stressors. And then the last level of protection is tier 3 ONRWs, which just means it's the most stringent level of protection. You don't allow any degradation, period. Those waters that you choose could be really crummy waters, just really highly valued waters. So by not allowing any degradation, you're sort of doing, the extreme version of restoration. You're just not allowing any further degradation. All right, so we'll break it down. So Tier 1, the regulatory, and again, if anybody has questions, feel free to raise your hand and ask, and Gemma will yell at me if I don't notice. Tier 1 is existing in-stream water uses and the level of water quality shall be, water quality necessary to protect the existing uses shall be maintained and protected, period. There's no flexibility there. You have to protect it. For all waters of the US, existing uses have to apply to all waters of the US. There's no choosing. Like Tier 2 and Tier 3, there's some identification of what's a Tier 2 water, what's a Tier 3 water. There is no choosing. It applies to all waters. That's, again, how it links to the existing use provisions under the designated uses regs. It requires maintenance and protection of existing uses. You've seen that definition before of what an existing use is. Again, unlike Tier 2 and Tier 3, where they're actually assigned, Tier 1 is a baseline protection and applies regardless of whether a state chooses to also apply Tier 2 and Tier 3. We're going to skip to Tier 3 because that's also much simpler. Tier 2 is a process, and we'll spend the majority of our time on that. Go ahead.
In the language of that, it says beneficial uses that are attained. What if they're not attained?
Sorry, in the previous
Yeah,
one?
in Tier 1.
This one?
Existing waters uses, no, the next one. Existing uses actually attained in the water body on or after, okay, well, what if they're not?
Then they're not. This is the definition of an existing use. So if you remember during the designated use module, we talked about the difference between an existing use and a designated use. An existing use is you know where there's an existing use where it's actually been attained. The actually means the use has occurred, and the attained means the water quality supported it. So where you've actually, at some point since November 28, 1975, that water has safely supported that use, that is an existing use. So that is your floor. If a use hasn't been attained yet, like either the use has occurred and the water quality didn't really support it, or the water quality supported it but the use hasn't occurred, that's a fabulous candidates for a designated use. But that's not the same thing here.
Okay, the example is if there's a designated use and they're failing to meet objectives, what if they make it worse? What if it's, the objective is 4, it's currently 20, they're over what the limit is, and they make it 80. Is that degradation? According to that, they have to have already attained it.
Right. So yeah, in that situation, that's an impaired water right there. We're sort of out of the anti-degradation realm at that point. So really what anti-degradation is really about, did someone say something? Okay, so the way to sort of think about it is that you've got your designated uses program, which is really intended to figure out what you're trying to achieve. In an ideal world, you are achieving that. If you are not achieving that, you're sort of in the impaired waters rule. We talked about monitoring and assessment, 303D, 305B reports that assess waters to say you're not meeting them. Waters get put on a 303D list to get prioritized for TMDLs. Your mechanism to restore those waters is TMDLs. The anti-deg world is really sort of on the opposite side of the spectrum, where you're now trying to protect waters in a way so that when they are doing better than they need to be, you don't degrade those waters without a proper process, without really thinking through, is that really what you want to do? So if I were to break it down, just like for designated uses in a UAA world where it's sort of it's your floor, you're basically saying you can remove a designated use, but no matter what, you've got to protect that existing use. You have to at least protect what has been achieved since November 28, 1975. The same baseline is an anti-degradation, because there are situations where you might have a Tier 2 water where you're doing better in certain places, but you still don't want to allow any permittee or any lowering that would jeopardize that existing uses. So what Tier 2 does is, let's say, and we'll get into all of this, but I feel like if I don't set the stage for you, then it might be a little hard. What Tier 2 is, let's say you've got it's really about protecting high quality waters where a water is achieving a level of water quality better than what is necessary. So let's say you've said that you need 4 micrograms per liter to protect parameter X. And that water, the actual ambient water quality happens to be at 2. Okay, so it's better. Let's just say, in a magical world, it's 2. And 2 is better. So they don't need to have 2. Technically, they could degrade the water to 4 and still be meeting their designated use, right? So what Tier 2 does is if you assign a water as at Tier 2, and for that parameter they're doing really well, our regulations require that there be a public process to determine whether or not, if a discharger wants to degrade that water from 2 to 3, 2 to 4, that there is a public process to decide if that's actually necessary to do. So that's why I was saying that this is like the perfect place for consideration of building resilience into your waters, is that you might need to use up those 2 units to accommodate some sort of economic development in the area. There just might have to be, and there's no other alternatives. Or maybe there's an alternative such that the discharger can still discharge, but there's a way to do it that wouldn't use up those 2 units of summative capacity. Or maybe you decide, you know what, this is a really important water. We know that it could succumb to climate change stressors. We're going to keep it at 2, so we've got a little bit of, wiggle room for it to handle things. So that's what Tier 2 is about. Tier 3 is really about just saying, we value these waters too much, we're not going to allow any degradation, period. That's the overall picture. So as we go through, we'll sort of show an example of kind of how it works. But just to sort of understand that the anti-deg world is really about where your water quality is better, and you're trying to make sure that there's no degradation of water quality that's already been achieved in terms of good water quality. Oop, hold on, can we grab hand her a mic, please? Thank you.
Sorry, just question regarding Tier 3. That I know that EPA has listing requirements or guidance for outstanding national water listing. Do we have the listing requirements? Do we have any guide how we delist some water bodies from outstanding national water list?
No, we don't have. The only real guidance we have on which waters to list is in the regulatory language that talks about such as waters of national and state parks and wildlife refuges and waters of exceptional recreation or ecological significance, that water quality shall be maintained and protected. Really, which waters are Tier 3 waters is at the discretion of the state. The agency has no authority to tell a state which waters have to be assigned for Tier 3.
Why I ask this question, because we had different arguments between government and stakeholders regarding the listing, that it's because it's arranged some company, because if we provide some evidence that water body can be delisted, and then again it's argued and it's no one wants that it's that water body delist.
Yeah, those are discussions that you have to work through with your public. There is a way, and we'll get to this, there is a way that some states have been able to walk that fine line between wanting to have something better than Tier 2, but not wanting to assign it at Tier 3, which is sort of a blanket, you can't degrade it at all. And so we'll get there in a minute. I'm not getting very far. It's okay.
Who in the state sets this? Maybe this is more a question for Rebecca. Is this Natural Resources that does this, or is it the Water Board for Tier 3, the National Resource Waters?
So the state of California has a state anti-degradation policy. So that's something that we should all be aware of in California. As far as designating outstanding national resource waters, it typically, I think, happens at the regional water board level. Lake Tahoe is identified as an ONRW. I think Mono Lake also, and I think that is it for the state. There have been some, the Gulf of the Farallones, or not. We'll have to, I wasn't aware of that, but it certainly could have some special designation, and I know that there was an effort to potentially designate the Smith River up in the very northern part of California, close to Oregon, so it's, tends to be a designation at the regional board level. I'm sure it could probably happen at the state board level too, should we so choose.
So my question is, if a regional board designates something as an outstanding natural resource water, does it need to go to the state board and go through OAL and all that kind of stuff?
Are you asking me?
I'm just asking, you know.
I don't even know what OAL stands for, so I'm not going to be very helpful.
Attorney General cert. Is it a water
So,
quality standard?
I could answer the federal part of that question. So under the federal regulations, there is no requirement that the assignment of a Tier 3 water be done by rule. Now, I will say that my colleagues in Region 10 feel otherwise because they feel like if you are going to say you cannot degrade that water quality, the power of that Tier 3 listing will come from putting that Tier 3 listing in state rule. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I like the latter approach, and certainly if the designations are contained in the basin plan, then it would be approved by the state, and then it would go to OAL, and then
Yes. So if the
potentially
state
also to you for
right,
approval.
that's exactly right. So if if a state chooses to put their Tier 3 list in rule, then that becomes binding water quality standards to which it would go through the normal standards process and come to EPA for approval. We would, to be fair, we would have no basis to disapprove because we would never promulgate a replacement or anything like that. Again, we have no authority to say which waters can or can't be a Tier 3 water, but if a state chooses to make it a Tier 3, we can legitimize it as a binding part of your standards.
Yeah, that seems to come under EPA's approval authority regarding a policy that affects the implementation or enforcement of a standard.
I think I would probably argue that it's still part of the anti-degradation because our regulations require you to have a category of Tier 3. Once you assign those waters, I think we would just add it to, we would call it a binding part of your implementation of how you're implementing Tier 3 for those specific waters, instead of calling it a general policy. I think we would call it what it is there. Okay, any other questions before I move on? All right. So what are ONRWs? We've talked quite a bit about this, but they're really waters that a state or tribe has assigned as a Tier 3 protection. So I do want to do sort of a public service announcement. So words can sometimes matter. So I would say do not use the word designate when you're talking about assigning or identifying a Tier 3 water. As a term of art, designate refers to a designated use. And if you talk about designating something, you put yourself in this box of, well, if you want to change that designation, you got to go through a UAA and that whole big process. That is not the intent with anti-degradation. The intent of anti-degradation is to be a bit more nimble, to be able to put things on your lists and take things off of your lists without going through any sort of UAA process. It's really a state decision-making process. So we have had some states that have gotten themselves into pickles where in rule they say they are designating a Tier 2 or Tier 3, and then their stakeholders have, some stakeholders have kind of gone to the books and made it a much more formal process to de-designate a water. So I caution the state of California and anybody else who's in this room to not use the word designate in your anti-degradation policy. Use either assign, identify, or something that's not designate. Okay, public service announcement done. All right, again, a state or tribe can classify any water as an ONRW. It doesn't have to be a high quality water. It can just be, it could be a swamp. It doesn't matter. It's what you feel like the only way to restore it will be to just stop degradation. It typically does include the waters that are viewed as pristine. I think Lake Tahoe might be there in that category. Highly valued waters, important to recreation or tourism, Lake Tahoe. Waters of exceptional ecological significance, importance, unique, or sensitive ecology. What does Tier 3 protection mean? It's the most stringent level of protection. Can't get any more than no degradation. No degradation allowed, except now we do say that you can do short-term or temporary basis. We're talking about weeks and months, not years. Usually this comes into place when there is like a public health issue that requires like insecticides to be applied, pesticides to be applied, something to be applied for like human health, public health type of things. Oh, look, Lake Tahoe.
Your comment about sort of an absolute floor of potentially weeks, maybe months, to go beneath that, the level of quality necessary to protect it, absolutely. What's your thought on the protecting existing uses and any temporal element with regard to a lowering?
We have not made a federal statement on that one. You know, in a world of amnesty here, the federal challenge process takes a while. So if you're talking weeks or months for the purposes of protecting public health, if there's a way for you to be able to say, if there's a reasonable belief that that water is going to bounce right back, I don't know that anybody's going to really challenge that. I mean, Terry, I don't know if I'm saying anything that you would disagree with, but I mean, yeah, I mean, we have actually made a federal statement on Tier 3 and being able to degrade it as a temporary thing. We've never said anything on the existing use side, but part of the Clean Water Act is protecting public health and welfare. So I think to the extent that that was still the ultimate goal, and one could say that in the long run, the existing use is still protected, I think a reasonable person would say, please protect public health. Okay, so an example of Tier 3, Lake Tahoe.
Well, actually, you know,
Oh.
I know that Regional Board 6, you know, they had like a, you know, they couldn't discharge, and they did get a general permit to discharge pesticides and herbicides to protect Lake Tahoe. So,
I think it was maybe under like the pesticide general permit,
yep.
the federal one? Yeah.
Well, we had a hi over here,
Oh,
Region
thank you.
6. We had a de facto prohibition that basically said that you couldn't detect pesticides in detectable limits, and we changed that to just a clean prohibition, but
Okay.
then with exemption criteria.
Okay.
And as part of the anti-DEG analysis for that basin plan amendment, we looked at temporary degradations, temporally and aerially. And that's,
Yeah, the pesticide general permit proved a bit of a challenge when it came to anti-degradation. And in the end, where we realized, the agency decided, I won't say we, the agency decided was that it was not degradation if the pesticide was applied according to instructions, that it was only degradation if there was a residual, that's what it is, I think.
yeah,
I think the boards may have done I think what you did was decide something more
So
stringent.
we had those conversations in the context of our basin plan amendment change, or basin plan amendment, and then to use the statewide general permit. The statewide general permit didn't have, general MPDS permit didn't have a very in-depth anti-DEG analysis from what I recall.
Yes.
The EPA attorneys that we talked to were pretty much like, oh, you guys are doing this analysis, great, we've been meaning to get to that. Well, sounds great. Yeah, I had one other thought, but I'll
Yeah, no, yes, is all I really say. It was, the anti-DEG portion of that whole process was a challenge, and it wasn't one that I think the agency was interested in trying to pursue. They felt like it could have derailed the general permit, and so I think they pushed it to the states.
Yeah, and I think the whole thing about the residue came out of the Cotton Council. I think that was a Supreme Court decision, and so they were kind of beholden to that.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say I'm the EPA Region 9 representative for that permit. If we want to have this discussion, we can happily do it afterwards at happy hour, but I think we'll derail the entire training
Yes.
session if we try and get into the details of this mess.
And from that segue, so interestingly enough, I think you all probably know acutely is that Lake Tahoe is at a tier 3 according to one state, which I believe is you all. California. Nevada does not consider it a tier 3. Is that true? Nevada does now? Okay. Well, then maybe is there any other state? No other state, right? So I guess I need to take out that bullet. All right. Okay, so now let's get to the harder part, tier 2. So it's a lot of words on this slide. You don't need to read them all. What the presentation does is it breaks down the very important parts of tier 2, and we'll talk about each part of that. But I'm going to highlight a few things for you. So the first key part is the very front that says where the quality of the waters exceeds levels necessary to support the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife and recreation in and on the water, that quality shall be maintained and protected. Pause. So what that means is not your designated use, because some waters don't have a designated use that meets the full 101A2 goal. But what this is saying is if your water is doing better for any parameter than what would otherwise be expected to be needed to maintain the Clean Water Act goal, that must be maintained and protected. Everybody with me so far? Okay, but tier 2 includes a little bit of an off-ramp, unless. Okay, so what is the off-ramp? So in essence, what this is all saying is unless the state finds that, and I'm going to skip down here, that allowing lower water quality is necessary to accommodate important economic or social development in the area in which the waters are located. Okay. Has anybody heard of the term an anti-degradation analysis or an analysis of alternatives? Okay. So, thank you, Terry. What the analysis of alternatives stems from is the necessary part, okay? So if you think about it sort of in common sense terms, if you have alternatives to the way a discharger wants to lower the water, then the way they want to lower the water is not necessary. Does that make sense? Because you have alternatives. It doesn't mean they can't lower the water quality. It doesn't mean that they can't discharge. It just means that what they're proposing originally isn't necessary. There is room for discussion on what else can be done.
Hi, just a big picture question. As far as designating tier 2 water bodies.
Assigning tier 2 water bodies.
As far as determining which water bodies are tier 2 versus tier 1 or tier 3, is that something that the states do beforehand, or is that more triggered by a
We're going to get
permit?
that. That's an excellent question. We're going to get that. So I'm just trying to paint a picture of all of the important things that are in here, and then we'll break them down, and we'll start somewhere around how do you decide what is high quality water. The other important things that we will talk about is you have to assure that the water quality adequately protects the existing uses fully. So even if you're a tier 2 water, you still have to protect existing uses. Even if you are allowing the lowering, you have to protect existing uses, meaning that is, again, your floor. And then there's this part about assuring that you've achieved the highest statutory and regulatory requirements and all cost-effective and reasonable best management practices for non-point sources. So those are the pieces that we're going to break down for you. Okay, so generally, what is tier 2 protection? I kind of already talked about this, but it's maintaining the water quality that's better than what's necessary to protect the 101A2 uses, not the designated use, the 101A2 use. They may or may not be the same thing. What is an assimilative capacity? So does anybody want to try and describe what an assimilative capacity is?
It's what the water body can handle in terms of pollutant load and still achieve the objectives or meet the beneficial uses?
Yeah. So, we'll go through an example, but a total fictitious thing, and I think I described it earlier. Let's say the criteria level for a particular parameter to protect a 101A2 use is 10 micrograms per liter. The water is at 5 micrograms per liter for that parameter in the ambient. You now have 5 micrograms per liter of assimilative capacity, meaning that a discharger could use up, discharger, now keep in mind, a discharger could be point or non-point sources, but a discharger could use up 5 milligrams per liter and still be maintaining the goals of the Clean Water Act. Now, you still have to protect your designated use. So let's just say, for example, that your designated use is something higher than a 101A2 use. okay? So your sum-of capacity, in theory, is what's between the 101A2 use and your ambient. But if you happen to assign a water quality, assign a designated use that really required it to be 8, then all of a sudden your practical sum-of capacity is only 3, right? Okay, so I did say it's not your designated use, but that ignores the fact that states have the discretion to adopt a designated use that's more stringent than the 101A2 uses. Okay, so in specific situations, the sum-of capacity may be utilized if it is necessary to accommodate important economic or social development in the area, and if there's been a tier 2 review, including public participation, to demonstrate that it is in fact necessary to accommodate. Okay, general picture of how you do a tier 2 review. First, you gotta identify which waters will be afforded tier 2 protection, and we'll go through how you do that. Figure out whether the degradation is necessary. That requires your anti-degradation analysis or an analysis of alternatives. Is it important, which is really about a socioeconomic kind of an analysis. Will it protect the existing uses? You do your tier 1 protection evaluation. Are you assuring achievement of the regulatory pollutant controls for point and non-point sources? All that really means is you have to make sure that that discharger, whoever is actually asking for the authorization to lower, is meeting all of their other requirements. They can't get a break on using up a sum of capacity if they're already not meeting their requirements. And then intergovernmental coordination, public participation. So only after all of this has been done can a state decide whether or not to authorize that lowering.
A question for you. So some of these sound like components that are not in the tier 3, like, so.
No, it's in the tier 2.
I know, yeah, so tier 3 is far easier to do than tier 2.
Yes, yeah, so that's why we covered tier 1, tier 3. They're kind of flat out, you just can't. The tier 2 becomes more complicated because there's that unless off-ramp. And so everything we're talking about now is, what would you need to do to satisfy the clause of you have to maintain and protect unless blah, 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 blah. So that's what we're talking about. Oops, you want the mic? You may not want it, but you have to have it.
For the point and non-point sources assure achievement, that just applies to that specific discharger or to all dischargers who discharge into the water body?
That is an excellent question. I believe it should be for the entire water body.
Yeah, because
yes.
We've run into this, and
Yes.
I've wondered.
It would have to be because you need to have an accurate representation of what your summative capacity really is.
Okay, thank you.
That's a very good question. Okay, going on. All right, so the state may, so this is another part of our regs, so the state may identify waters for the protections described in a paragraph, blah, 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 on a parameter by parameter basis or a water body by water body basis. So Lori, this is getting to your question about how does one identify high quality water? Our regs explicitly say you can either do it on a parameter by parameter basis or a water body by water body basis, and we'll talk about what the difference is between both. A parameter by parameter basis, it is not done up front. It's generally done as needed, and it's where the water quality is determined to be high quality based on examining data on specific parameters. So you essentially assess each parameter individually, and your high quality water is where you've got, for a specific parameter, you do your data monitoring and you figure out that the ambient is better than the criteria that would be necessary to pick the 101A2 use. Voila, that water is a high quality water, a tier 2 water for that parameter. So this is just an example. We don't need to go over it again, but the idea being if you've got a criterion to predict aquatic life is 120, the ambient is 20, you've got 100 micrograms per liter of a summative capacity. You generally, on a parameter by parameter basis, you decide that that water is a tier 2 on a case by case basis. And it might be tier 2 for some parameters and not for others. It's a very objective sort of evaluation. Oops, we'll go here and then pass
I'm just curious, once you've made that identification, if you need to record that anywhere, or it's just for a case-by-case examination of taking up a simulative capacity or
That's
something.
an excellent question. It would be, because it's on case by case, it would be recorded in the permit fact sheet. The permit fact sheet.
Is it enough only one parameter from the listed other parameters for identify that it's that water body can have high quality?
Are you asking whether or not it's okay if it's tier 2, if one water body is a tier 2 water only for one parameter?
One parameter.
Sure, if that's the only parameter for which it's exceeding the water quality, then sure. If it's the only parameter for which there's a summative capacity, that's fine. There's no rules that it has
So
to be.
once it's not.
Yeah, if you're not, if you're right at the criterion for all the other parameters and it's only one parameter for which you're doing better, that's fine.
Okay.
That is one of the advantages of a parameter by parameter basis, is that you're still protecting it at a parameter by parameter, even if it's just one parameter. Okay. For a water body by water body basis, this one has been a little bit more controversial because I'll just leave it at that. So let me describe it and then you'll see what I mean. On a water body by water body basis, states will assign a whole water as a tier 2 up front. They do their evaluation and they decide as a water body, this water is a tier 2 water body. Now, if you think about it, you're talking about a high quality water body. One could argue that it's a holistic evaluation. It doesn't make sense for it to be just based on a parameter per parameter basis. It makes sense to say, this water we believe is high quality based on a suite of information that reflects biological, physical, chemical, aesthetic quality information. So we said, you know what, that's okay. That seems to be in line with the intent. However, it has to actually be a holistic evaluation. So what we did was, what ended up happening during our reg revision, so this was all added when we revised the 131 regs back in 2013 and 2015, is we heard from stakeholders that states were refusing to protect water bodies as a whole using a water body by water body basis purely because the water was impaired for mercury. And that was it. So mercury affects the human health portion of it. The water could have been high quality for every other parameter on there, but because mercury affected its ability to protect sort of the human health portion, say the fish consumption portion of their designated uses, they decided that as a whole, that water body did not fall under tier 2 and therefore was not in any way at all having to go through a review to use up any assimilative capacity. And so what we did was we said that a water cannot be excluded. When using a water body by water body approach, you cannot exclude that water from a tier 2 assignment only because it's not meeting all of the uses. So it's a little bit of, there's a whole lot of negatives in there, but what it really means is, let's just say you've got aquatic life use and recreation use, and you have a parameter that's messing with your recreation use. Let's say you put fishing in recreation, but it's high quality for aquatic life. You can't say we're just not going to protect it at all as tier 2. We're saying that if it's got high quality parameters for aquatic life, then it should still be tier 2. Now, the thing is that you're still not going to have a similar capacity for mercury. So you're not going to do, it's not, so from the identification of a water as a tier 2 happens on a parameter by parameter or water body by water body basis. But once you've done that, you're still doing your anti-deg review only where you have a summative capacity. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes, Larry.
I'm trying to figure out how this construct fits with California. As far as I know, we have not designated any tier 2, we haven't done that up front as far as tier 1, tier 2. We have some outstanding resource waters, tier 3. I'm thinking that by default everything is tier 2, but I'm looking to Stacy.
Yeah, I don't know.
Do
Do you guys do it on a parameter by parameter basis? Like a case, do you guys do your anti-deg tier 2s on a parameter by parameter basis? Yeah, so then for that reason, you wouldn't do it up front. You would do it as the discharge is asking for the authorization to lower the water quality.
That's correct.
So what California is doing is this approach, where you don't do it up front. You do it, so if a permit is up for reissuance, at that time, you would say, all right, this permit is looking for limits for blah, 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 blah. So you would have to do an analysis for each of those parameters as compared to the ambient water quality to see if there is a limit of capacity, for which you would have to do a tier 2 review before you authorize a limit that would lower the water ambient.
Yeah, that's my understanding, and then, so I'm thinking that by default, all of our waters are tier 2 unless they are designated as tier 1. I mean, it's tier 3. We have no tier 1.
Well, so I think you have to.
I'm sorry, I used the word designated again.
Yes, you did. That's okay.
Assign.
So I think you have to sort of take it. You have to step back. So in a parameter by parameter based approach, you're not assigning waters as tier 2. You've taken it out. So because assigning a water as a tier 2 is inherently a water body by water body approach. A parameter by parameter approach doesn't do that. You would say on a case by case basis when issuing the permit, okay, this water is high quality for X parameter based on the evaluation that was done at that moment as a part of that permit reissuance process. So what I would say instead is that your state evaluates whether or not a water will be protected as a tier 2 water on a parameter by parameter basis. That's how I would describe it. But I would not say by default all your waters are tier 2.
But the assumption is that there's an analysis.
Correct.
There are no water bodies where you would say it's a tier 1.
Well, tier 1 applies to all waters anyway. So for when you would do that analysis at the permit reissuance, you would say you have to make sure that when you're authorizing that lowering, that authorization wouldn't result in going below the existing use.
Okay.
I don't know, Stacy and Rebecca, you wanted to say anything more? Did I do okay?
No, you were great. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks. I know there were a lot of hands up. Has anyone at the national level spoken to the need for consistency between multiple permits to the same water body in terms of, for this permit, parameter by parameter, we designated tier 2. Does somebody have to always go looking through the record next time there's a permit to the same water body?
So, like I said, when you're doing it as a parameter by parameter basis, you're not assigning the water as a tier 2. You're literally just looking, is the water quality, is the ambient better than this number, and what's the estimated capacity? The trick ends up being, and I think this might be what you're getting at, is if there are multiple permittees that are up for reissuance at the same time, and let's just say, in our example, in this example, okay, you've got 100 micrograms per liter of estimated capacity, but you've got 5 discharges that are up for reissuance at the same time, and all 5 are being, I don't know how you all operate, but let's just say there's 5 different permit writers who are writing those permits, and they don't talk to each other, and all 5 decide, sure, we're gonna let you take 100 micrograms per liter. That's gonna be a problem, right? So I don't know if that's where you were going, but I would imagine that there does need to be some conversations amongst the permit writers when writing those permits.
Yeah, I was talking about permits written at different times, the same water body where the coordination's even harder, but it is the same general question.
That would probably be a good question for the permits program. I think.
I am the permits program.
Well, I meant from the. You are the permits program in Region 9, yes. I meant at the national level. I'm not sure if at the national level they have provided any guidance to permit writers. So I would imagine that is probably something for the states to sort out, or the regional programs to help the states sort out how to permit when there's multiple dischargers involved. Yeah.
I was just curious if any states are using their integrated reporting categories as part of this. So we have, category 1 and category 2, where we show that all the available data we have shows that beneficial uses are being supported. Couldn't you categorize waters or tier waters using that information?
You could. What we've actually found is where it becomes a problem is where people are using their 303D lists to decide where things are not tier 2, and that's a little bit more of a problem. So there's obviously in doing your integrated reporting stuff, there is limits to data. So you do have to be careful with deciding that You're only going to assign, like if you wanted to do the water body by water body approach, that you're only going to assign the waters as a high quality water based on your integrated report, or you're going to exclude waters because there are situations where information might not be available, but you certainly could use it as a starting point. Oklahoma does that. Oklahoma uses their lists for decisions on tier 2 waters. That's the one state I know of. 15 minutes, okay.
Do you ever come across issues where you have two states with different, like a water body between them? I mean, you were talking about Lake Tahoe, but like they have different ideas about that water body and conflict between the states, and does EPA get involved with that or what?
We can. I can't think of one in the anti-DEG world off the top of my head. I mean, the classic example of a state conflict was Arkansas and Oklahoma, which went all the way to the Supreme Court, where they had different designated uses. But I don't know off the top of my head about a conflict in the tiering. I think in general, our regs would suggest that, as a part of the public process, that there's conversations with the states. I would hope that if you're in the anti-DEG world, that there's a common interest in protecting the water. We have, dispute resolution mechanisms and things like that in our regs, which are always available to be used in those situations. But I don't know one of an example off the top of my head. Okay, yes.
So just trying to make sure I understand, for the tier 2, when you have multiple dischargers of the same water body, then you would have to look at each one individually, and you might say, like a POTW, maybe you do decide, yeah, we're going to allow some degradation because it's essential, but manufacturer next door, we're not going to allow it for you because you don't meet those same criteria. So it's not a blanket. It's each individual permit as
That's
they
right.
come up would.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
And then how does non-point source play into that?
That's an excellent question. So, we'll talk about this, but, typically the implementation of anti-DEG happens with 402 permits, right? Because there's no explicit authorization of non-point sources. So this is an issue that came up as a result of a lawsuit in Florida, where there has been question about, listings and anti-degradation. I think what I can tell you is anti-DEG applies to the water body as a whole. Generally, people do the tier 2 reviews when the lowering is triggered by a point source. Where a state regulates its non-point sources, that would also warrant a tier 2 review. Where non-point sources aren't regulated, it becomes a bigger problem. If you're not necessarily authorizing the lowering, but it would be impaired if they're not. And so the open legal question right now is what happens in a situation where a lowering has occurred. Let's say it's more typically happening in a tier 3 water, well, tier 2 and tier 3. What happens if a lowering occurs, but that lowering is purely the result of a non-point source? Is that water listed for violating the anti-degradation requirements? That is sort of the legal question that's kind of floating out there right now. And I think the legal case in Florida implied that yes, that water would have to be listed for violating anti-degradation requirements. The issue is what has to be done about it. So that's a hot button question.
What's the name of that case, please?
Davis. It's got Davis in it. I don't know the full. The administrator, EPA versus Davis, something like that.
Okay, thanks.
It was he was challenging. It came about as challenging EPA's approval of Florida's 303D list. Okay, I might have to keep going. Can we hold on just a second? I'm around all day.
I
So.
was just going to say we have 10 minutes and 20 slides.
Yeah, thank you. All right, flying through. All right, I already talked about that. Okay, necessary and important. Okay, so we talked about this. So this is just highlighting the language in there. All right, so how do you decide if something is degradation is necessary? So the regs require you to identify a range of practicable alternatives for the parameters. And that practicable means technologically possible, able to put in practice, economically viable, and it has to be a range of non-degrading to less degrading. So the issue here that we were trying to deal with was people were doing alternatives analyses, but it was kind of a lame attempt. So what we said was, okay, you got to identify do an alternatives analysis, and it has to be looking for practicable alternatives that range the whole spectrum. So you have to do a real job at doing that alternatives analysis. If there is a practicable alternative that is identified, you have to select one of those. We don't say you have to select the least degrading one, because at this point we were just happy that someone was doing a real alternatives analysis. So if you found that there is a practicable alternative to that lowering that would lessen the degradation than the original proposed lowering, you have to do one of those. You can pick whatever you want, but you got to do one of those. Some states do still require the least degrading alternative, but that is more stringent than federal regulations now. The alternatives analysis can be conducted by anybody, but in the end, it's the state or tribe that takes responsibility for that finding that the lowering was necessary. Okay, so is the lowering important for socioeconomic development? You'd basically just evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of lowering the quality of a high-quality water for the community. It could be employment, community tax base, house impacts. Gary is going to talk about the economics guidance that we have, which will be some of the same factors that you would use. Oh, there it is, right there. The interim economic guidance for water quality standards. There's a lot of flexibility in how that analysis can be conducted. Our guidance is just guidance. There might be other ways. But again, the analysis can be conducted by anybody else, but the state or tribe is responsible for making that final decision. All right, existing use protection. All right, I think we beat that one. You just have to make sure that you're protecting existing uses. All right. Further, the state shall assure. So this is the part about the assuring the highest statutory regulatory requirements. For point sources, what that really means is you just have to make sure that you're meeting your regulatory requirements. There's your answer. All dischargers must be in compliance with the current regulations, and all current regulations must be properly implemented. For non-point sources, all cost-effective and reasonable best management practices required by the state are implemented. So this idea of it's only the ones that are required by was an interpretation of our regulations. It's called the Davis Memo, Tudor Davies Memo, that was done back in the 90s, I think, that interpreted just the 131.12 regulation language as saying that it's only about ensuring that where non-point sources are regulated, that those are being implemented. It's different. We have similar language in the uses regs, and that is not limited to only where regulated. So, point being that there isn't a requirement to actually regulate your non-point sources or to implement any new BMPs, but the idea is that where you do regulate your non-point sources, you have to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. All right, stakeholder input. You have to have it, is really what that means. So there has to be a public process. It doesn't have to be a public hearing like a use change, but there does have to be a public process in those Tier 2 reviews. So in a hypothetical example, this is sort of the same that we had before, which I think I can kind of blow through, but we have the criteria is 120 to protect the aquatic life, which is a 101A2 use. The current ambient is at 20. Luis's Widget Factory wants to discharge that would anticipate to bring the zinc concentrations to 50. So if we're looking at it in a graphical standpoint, you've got your assimilative capacity is the distance between here and here. It's your 100 micrograms per liter. And Luis's Widget Factory wants to use up 30 micrograms per liter of that assimilative capacity. So you would do an alternatives analysis and to determine whether or not the degradation is necessary, and you would evaluate whether or not it's important for socioeconomic development for Louisa's Widget Factory to use up that 30 micrograms per liter. And part of that socioeconomic evaluation can be, for example, your climate change considerations. All right, so this is where I was talking about where some states have found a way to walk a fine line between Tier 3 and Tier 2. This concept of Tier 2.5 is not in EPA's regulations. What states have done, because Tier 3 is sort of draconian, right? It's like absolutely no degradation, except for short term. What some states have done is they've kind of souped up their Tier 2, so souped up version being the one on the far side, where they say instead of Tier 2 being, where you have to maintain and protect unless you do all these things, they might say you cannot degrade the water except in these limited circumstances. So it's more stringent than Tier 2, but less stringent than Tier 3, thus the Tier 2.5. There's no regulations from our standpoint, so you could come up with whatever exceptions you want. When we review that, if it comes to us, we would basically review it using the Tier 2 bar. So there would be no reason for us to really disapprove it because you're more stringent than Tier 2. Make sense? So that's an option. Okay, you've seen the schematic 100 times, so you'll see that anti-DEG plays its role sort of right there in between standards and permitting. All right, implementation methods. Sorry, I forgot about these slides. Okay, implementation methods. This is describing how the policy may be applied. The only really rules is that it has to be consistent with and address all the components in both the state's policy and EPA's regulations. So you got to talk about the 3 tiers of protection, the various components of Tier 2 review, compliance with the 316, which is about thermal discharges. It has to be publicly available, and you have to provide an opportunity for public involvement during the development and any revision of a method. You can provide additional details that explain how the state policy will be implemented. And this is the key. It can be adopted, it can be incorporated by reference, or it can be completely non-binding. In the first 2 instances, EPA would take action on it. In the latter, EPA wouldn't. Now, of course, if your implementation method is not binding, it's also not binding for you all when implementing it. So there are pros and cons to that.
Non-binding. When we've reviewed non-binding, we've made sure that the implementation didn't undermine the actual policy.
Yes.
So we ended up reviewing and approving it.
Yes, so there have been instances where, let's say the policy is being revised or is being adopted at the same time as the implementation method. We do have the authority to disapprove the policy because the way the state has described its implementation is inconsistent either with the policy or with the federal regulations. What's generally happening now is that that's a little harder now because the policies are usually already established, and then they go and revise, a state might go and revise their anti-DEG implementation method, which is non-binding. In that situation, we end up in a place where we may have to object to a permit if the permit is being implemented in a way that's inconsistent with the way the policy was written. That would be the recourse. Okay, policy versus implementation. So your policy would basically repeat, right here, the Tier 2 idea, but the implementation methods would talk about how you identify high quality waters. It would talk about what kind of permit application forms would be done to document your alternatives analysis. It would describe how the public is going to be involved and how the high quality water will be protected. So really, the policy is about your what. It's about your baseline. What is it that you're trying to do? Your implementation method is describing how it's going to be done. My colleague who wrote this thing described it as you kind of need to have both to make your delicious cake. You have your ingredients, you have your recipe. If you miss any one of those, your cake's not going to turn out so good. All right, EPA's review, really we were just reviewing the policy to make sure it's consistent with our regulations. Are the existing uses, high quality waters, ONRWs protected, meaning are there categories to allow for those protections, as well as thermal discharges. For implementation methods, we want to make sure that they're actually clearly identified, not just stuck in someone's desk drawer. Are they consistent with our regulations? Are they consistent with the state's policy? Was the public able to provide input? And is the implementation method publicly available? So these are just examples, which I will go ahead and skip. You guys can read those. Those are pretty easy. So it just tells you different things about how they structure their implementation methods versus their tiering system. This, as I mentioned this earlier, anti-deg requirements apply to all waters of the U.S. It doesn't matter point source, non-point source, just like all standards, applies to the water body. Anti-deg reviews, however, are generally triggered by any activity that would lower water quality and are at minimum typically done by those things that are actually regulated under the Clean Water Act, such as MPDS permits, 404 permits, where there's a 401 certification due to a federal permit. I'm gonna skip that. All right, so we had questions. Why don't I quickly go through a couple review? Can I take 2 minutes? Sure. Why not, right? Yeah. All right, just because I don't know if you guys have the answers to these questions. So anti-degradation policies and implementation methods address both point and non-point sources of pollution. True or false? Very good. True. Oops, well, I just showed you the answer there. Haha. Federal anti-degradation policy allows existing uses to be impaired by lowering water quality standards. False. Outstanding natural resource waters can include swamps or hot springs. True. Regulation pertaining to anti-degradation policies say that economic development cannot be the basis for the lowering of water quality. False. EPA has the authority to promulgate an anti-degradation policy for a state or authorized tribe. True. True. So even though, this is why I wanted to go through these review questions. So even though an anti-deg policy, we actually have the authority to promulgate an anti-degradation implementation method as well. But we do. So just like for a policy, that's required to be in rule. If we disapprove, we have the full authority to promulgate a policy. We do also have the authority to promulgate an implementation method. Even though it is not required to be in rule, if EPA determines that new revised standards are necessary, meaning either the state does not have implementation methods or the implementation methods are undermining the state policy or the federal regulations, we would have the authority, if the agency wanted, to promulgate replacement implementation methods, which we have done. All right. States authorized tribes anti-deg policy must be identical to EPA's policy. False. That's it. Yay. Okay, I'll be around if people want to ask questions.